Well, hi there, everyone, and welcome to another week of the good news according to Job. It is with great excitement that we turn to a new section this week. We hear a new voice, someone that we haven't heard before, someone that perhaps you didn't even know was there. They have been lingering in the background. They have been ears or a fly on the wall, if you want to put it that way, listening in on this whole discourse that has been taking place between Job and the three friends. And this person is Elihu. Before we look at what Elihu has to say, it is very interesting just to pick up on a few of the things about who Elihu is. Elihu, we don't know particularly who he is and the exact genealogy of where he comes from or anything of that sort. But something that we can pick up on is that Elihu is slightly different to the other three friends simply by his name. Elihu is a name that you will find in the history of Israel's people. You will find the name popping up every now and then. Not a lot, but it is a Hebrew name. So what this tells us is that perhaps we should be anticipating that Elihu will give the correct answer, where the three friends who don't bear Hebrew names, one would expect them not to be able to answer Job in the correct way. So there's this little bit of a play on one that bears a name of an Israelite, a Hebrew name, that he should have the insight and the correct knowledge and wisdom to be able to answer Job in light of Job's circumstance. As we're going to turn to this passage, unfortunately, we are going to see that that's not necessarily the case. Simply being a Hebrew or Israelite doesn't mean that you're going to even have the right answer. But he comes close to some profound truths about who God is and the way God functions and acts and is. But yet there are limitations to his thinking as well, and those thoughts somehow still creep back to what the three friends have been saying up until this point. But this week we are turning to chapters 32, 33, 34, 35, 36, and all the way through to 37. So it's a chunky piece. We're not going to read the whole thing at all. There's way too much happening there. But the reason why I would like to look at it as a whole today is that there is a significant structure to the way in which Elihu at least argues and challenges Job. But also, it's going to be helpful to see the whole package of what Elihu says. To break it up, you will lose a sense of the argument and the way in which Elihu is going about it. So, if you want to turn and you have your Bibles with you as you're listening to this and watching this talk, in Job 32, we find the introduction, and then there are a number of things taking place. But just a few things, just out of interest and something that we want to highlight just as we go into this passage. Notice what it says in verse 1. So these three men stopped answering Job because he was righteous in his own eyes. So this is again giving us context as to why the three friends have stopped speaking. If you were wondering why did Zophar not reply at all, or perhaps why have they not carried on to talking with Job? Well, here's the reason. The author has put this in just before Elihu speaks. They have stopped speaking because, in their opinion, Job sees himself as righteous in his own eyes, and that can have a strange slant to it. Well, we are told as the reader that Job is upright, he is blameless, he fears God and he shuns evil. But it is almost as if the author is saying, let's see it through the eyes of the three friends as we are about to be introduced to a new friend. And as we are drawn, or as our attention is drawn to that, we see that it is the friend's disgruntled feeling that Job is seeing himself as righteous and therefore he won't listen to them. And so a new person comes onto the scene. Then verse 2, but Elihu, son of Barachel, the Buzite of the family of Ram, became very angry with Job for justifying himself rather than God. And so here he is saying, what the author is giving us insight to is that Elihu is frustrated. He's angry with Job because Job is trying to worm his way out of his circumstance, worm his way out of his suffering, and trying to explain it in a way that contradicts what the three friends have been saying. And that would make sense if it stayed at that point, but we see that Elihu is actually not just frustrated with Job because it doesn't fit his framework of thinking, but he is also frustrated and angry with the friends. Listen to what it says in verse 3. He was also angry with the three friends because they had found no way to refute Job, and yet had condemned him. So this is interesting. He's saying, well, the way you've argued is not helpful. You haven't argued against him in a way that proves that he's actually wrong, and yet you've just condemned him. Essentially, that's all you've done. They have condemned him on the grounds of lack of evidence, lack of being able to make a persuasive argument. And so this is important to see that Elihu is frustrated in the way that they've argued, because the way in which they've argued isn't solid. It isn't ironclad. It isn't in the way that is systematic and makes sense. They've simply argued, condemned, and they're done. They're not going to speak anymore because, well, Job sees himself as righteous, and there's no arguing with a person that's made up their mind about how they see themselves. And then it goes on in verse 4. Now Elihu had waited before speaking to Job because they were older than he. But when he saw that the three men had nothing more to say, his anger was aroused. So here is Elihu, who is, we are told, is younger than everybody else, most likely even younger than Job. And so here he is now frustrated with these friends who, one would assume with age comes wisdom, and therefore would be able to argue properly and show Job the errors in his ways in a way that makes sense, and be able to help him to be able to do what he needs to do. That would be the logical reasoning of it. But Elihu is frustrated because the friends seem to have given up. They seem to have decided that they can't argue with Job anymore, and for that reason they aren't going to say anything else. And so this is the setting of the scene, at least for us, as Elihu enters and as he is about to speak. There are a couple of sections to Elihu's discourse that might be helpful for you to just... It's a big section, so in order to navigate our way through it, what might be helpful is just to pick up on a few sections. So I'm going to just list the kind of sections that there are here. You could divide the first section and title it, if you want to, as the Preamble. The Preamble starts in verse 6 of chapter 32, and that runs basically all the way to verse 7 of chapter 33. So this Preamble is Elihu establishing the grounds from which he can speak from. So Elihu is going to highlight a couple things, that he's young and that wisdom needs to come from God, and we'll pick up on some of those ideas, but the Preamble really establishes the ground from which he believes he can speak. And then the first, if you want to put it, the first real section, and what marks the sections of Elihu's discourse is, if you want to put it this way, the paraphrasing of Job's words, and therefore the challenge of what Job has said. So it is, he quotes Job in some way or form, and then he challenges Job on what he has said. So notice there in verse 8 to 11, 8 starts by saying, "But you have said in my hearing, I heard the very words." This is how he starts. And then he says in verse 9, 10, and 11, he explains what he has heard. And he kind of paraphrases some of the things that Job has said. And if you recall, you might pick up some of what he is saying here is true. Job has said it in some way or form. But often it's again that situation of what they hear and how they perceive what Job is saying may be different. But we're not going to look at that just yet. Notice the first section, at least it's highlighted by this, and that is at least verse 8 marks the first section. "But you have said in my hearing, I heard the very words." And then the next section, the next challenge, or where he challenges what Job has said, is in chapter 34. If you go down there, he says in verse 5, he says, "Job says, I am innocent, but God denies my justice, and so on. So there you have the next section where Elihu challenges something that Job has said. If you go on, you'll find there's a third account of that. In chapter 35, in verse 2, it says, "Do you think this is just? You say, I am in the right." And this seems to mark almost the third time that Elihu actually challenges directly something that Job has actually said. And so that makes up the bulk of Elihu's discourse as he is about to now challenge Job. Each section he highlights something particular that Job has said, and we'll highlight those very briefly and just look at some of the stuff that Elihu says in light of what Job has said. But then ultimately we need to get to more the conclusive thought that comes across in chapter 36. He brings with him a conclusion in verse 8 onwards. You find a bit of a conclusion to what Job says. And then what we have is this final chapter. We have this final point that he starts to make as he really gets Job to consider who God is, which seems to be absolutely fantastic. But in light of what he's just said, kind of creates a bit of a contradiction to what he has been saying to Job. All right. So if that gives you a bit of context as to how the book flows, try and see it in those sections. It won't feel as overwhelming because of it being such a big section. But let's pick up at least in the preamble, at least what he's trying to highlight there. Notice a couple things. In verse 6, it says there, "So Elihu, son of Barkel the Buzite, said, I am young in years, and you are old. That is why I was fearful, not daring to tell you what I know. I thought age should speak, advanced years should teach wisdom. But it is the Spirit in a person, the breath of the Almighty that gives them understanding. It is not only the old who are wise, not only the aged who understand what is right." And so he starts really profoundly. Elihu starts on a strong foot, and you go, this is going to be good. Elihu might actually have some wisdom to share. Yes, he's young, and he makes sure that we are aware of that, but he says that wisdom doesn't simply come from age, from experience in life, but wisdom comes truly from God. Wisdom comes from the Spirit. And this is profound. None of the three friends have said this up until this point, and so Elihu is the first that actually highlights a slightly different slant on where wisdom comes from. And keeping in mind, Job is all about wisdom, not human wisdom, but actually God's wisdom, and how profound God's wisdom is. And so as we look at this passage here, this preamble, Elihu highlights the fact that he's been afraid to some degree of wanting to speak because he is aware that he is younger and he doesn't have the age, the wisdom that comes with age on his side. But he does have a knowledge and understanding that wisdom does come from God. But as he says this, he picks up on a phrase, and this is actually very interesting just to notice it. He says it actually quite a number of times. We can at least see it 4 times or 5 times in the first section. The 5th time he changes it slightly. But Elihu is trying to affirm that he does have something to say. So the first time we hear it, he says this, as I read in verse 6, maybe you picked it up. He says, so he says that is why I was fearful, not daring to tell you what I know. So he knows something, but he was afraid to tell them what he knew because of their age. But then he says in verse 10, listen to this. Therefore I say, listen to me, I too will tell you what I know. And then in verse 17, he says it again. I too will have my say. I too will tell you what I know. And then go down to chapter 33, verse 3. He says, my words come from an upright heart. My lips sincerely speak what I know. And then you go again to the end of chapter 33, and it concludes with a slight change in his wording. And this time around he says, but if not, then listen to me. Be silent, and I will teach you wisdom. Not now what I know, but now I will teach you wisdom. And now he's diving even deeper. He is saying that what he knows isn't simply knowledge, but it is actually wisdom. There is depth to it. But it's interesting just to highlight how Elihu's building up almost the courage to say more and to be strengthened, supposedly by the Spirit of God who encourages him to speak. That's at least Elihu's perspective. That's Elihu's way of seeing it and thinking about it. So it's helpful for us to just pay attention to how his language begins to develop and change as he goes. But as with regards to the preamble, he makes some profound statements. Another thing that we can just pick up, he says in verse 12, this is fascinating. He says, I gave you my full attention, but not one of you has proved Job wrong. So he's not simply talking to Job, but he's actually turning to the friends at the same time, and he's saying, I'm talking to Job, but I'm also talking to you three who have actually failed to help Job, failed to speak to Job, failed to point Job in the right direction. So I'm speaking to you as well, which comes as strong words. Remember that he has been silent for so long because he feared to speak because he was younger than them, and now he is saying, well, he's actually angry, and we've been told that he's angry, and this is now what he has to say to the friends. Then listen to the first verse of chapter 33. But now, Job, listen to my words, pay attention to everything I say. I am about to open my mouth, my words are on the tip of my tongue. My words come from an upright heart. My lips sincerely speak what I know. And so this is fascinating because the last time that we have heard of someone being regarded in any category of as upright, it has been Job. Job is the one who is upright. Job is the one who is blameless. Job is the one who fears God. Job is the one who shuns evil. And suddenly, here is Elihu claiming that he actually has an upright heart, and that is where he is speaking from. He is speaking from a heart that is upright. Now, the question isn't whether Elihu really is upright or not. That's not in question. That we only see that here. That's the only mention of Elihu, his heart, his state of being, and that's not really held into question. And it seems to be the case as it runs through to the final conclusion of Job, because Elihu isn't brought back into the picture at all again. Only the three friends are really highlighted. But with regards to what he says, we need to line it up with who Job is, line it up with what God has told us about Job, what the author has revealed to us about Job, who we know Job to be. And that is always important as we look at this. As we go on, and listen to what it says in verse 5. Answer me then, if you can, stand up and argue your case before me. I thought this was just interesting, just to highlight for you. It's interesting that he says this because it's actually Job who says, I want to stand before God and argue my case. And here Elihu is actually saying, well, stand up in front of me and argue your case. Argue, answer me, and let's argue. You argue your case in front of me. And it's, I find it peculiar. Has he not heard, he says he's been listening in, has he not heard that Job actually wants to talk and argue with God? And so there seems to be this subtle undertone that actually Elihu is thinking of himself as one that is being used by God to share God's word, to bring about understanding and wisdom to the situation that Job is sitting in. And therefore, whether Job argues before God himself or Elihu, who is doing an aspect of God's work, if you want to put it that way, it's the same thing. So this is interesting that Elihu is taking on this role. And so later on, he unfolds it a little bit further and puts into question, he actually asks, will you listen to the messenger? Someone who is in a position that actually needs to hear something, will they listen to the messenger that is sent by God? Because if they do, then there is something that will transpire, and that we'll pick up a little bit later, but that's jumping a little bit ahead. The next thing that we do need to just look at is this question, or at least what he hears Job having said, and then how he recommunicates it and how he answers it. So notice what he says, the first section, the first statement. if you want to carry on with the picture of a court case, as they're having this argument, he is now presenting Job's words, and now Job is supposedly needing to give an account. But first, before that, Elihu is going to argue why what Job has said is wrong. So listen to what he says. Verse 9, picking up, these are supposedly Job's words. He says, I am pure. Job, you said, I am pure. I have done no wrong. I am clean and free from sin. Yet God has found fault with me. He considers me his enemy. He fastens my feet in shackles. He keeps close watch on all my paths. Now, Job has had that kind of idea. He is not saying, we can't be led to believe that Job is actually in the same camp as the friends. The friends have said, well, your circumstances is a result of what you have done. But when Job says that God has found fault in me, we do know that he has said it at a point where he considers perhaps God has found fault in me that I'm not aware of. And that is one consideration that Job has. But ultimately, Job sees himself as an enemy to God because God is constantly afflicting him. God's arrows have pierced him, and he makes a number of strong representations and images of what it looks like, what he feels like is happening, that he has become this enemy to God. And so Elihu says, well, there's something drastically wrong with what you have said there. There is a lot that you have said that isn't right. Notice what Elihu's response is in verse 14. He says, for God does speak, now one way, now another, though no one perceives it. And this is interesting because, again, he's obviously picked up on some of the things that Job says. Job says, I've cried out to God, but he doesn't answer me. And here, at this point, what Elihu is actually saying is, well, actually, God does speak, and he is speaking, but you are incapable of perceiving, though no one perceives it, as he says. He's actually insinuating that Job doesn't perceive God's voice. So now, pick up on just some of the things that he says. And I won't read the whole section, but just notice what he says in verse 19. Or someone may be chastened on a bed of pain, with constant distress in their bones. So this begins to paint a picture of someone like Job. And Elihu is saying, so that their body finds food repulsive, that their soul loathes the choicest meal, their flesh wastes away to nothing, and their bones once hidden now stick out. And so this really actually looks like Job. This looks like who Job is at this point. But listen to what he says in verse 23. He says, yet if there is an angel at their side, a messenger, 1 out of 1,000, sent to tell them how to be upright, and he is gracious to that person and says to God, spare them from going down to the pit. I have found a ransom for them. Let their flesh be renewed like a child's. Let them be restored as in the days of their youth. And so there's a subtle undertone. Or maybe it's a little bit more blatant, but what Elihu is doing is he's coming alongside Job and he's saying, listen to the messenger, listen to the angel, listen to the one that brings you a word from God. Listen to that. Perceive what God is saying. God is speaking to you, so listen to what he has to say. And if you receive it, perhaps then God will restore you. Now, this is sounding very similar to what the friends have been saying up until this point. And listen to what it says in verse 27. And they will go to others and say, I have sinned, I have perverted what is right, but I did not get what I deserved. So he is saying that the outcome of those that will receive the rebuke and repent, that they will actually receive what they don't deserve. And then verse 29 and 30, it says, God does all these things to a person twice, even 3 times, to turn them back from the pit, that the light of life may shine on them. And he is saying, well, Job, what is happening to you is to turn you back from the pit, to turn you in your tracks, to turn back to God, to go back to him, because otherwise the path that you are on is one of destruction. And then just another thing to pick up on in this verse 32. If you have anything to say, answer me, speak up, for I want to vindicate you. This is interesting because Job longs for someone, a redeemer, a vindicator, someone that will stand in the gap and deal with Job and the situation between Job and God. And he's saying, speak up, say what you need to say, because I want to vindicate you. Now, this is the first time any of the friends have ever said anything like this. And this is now not actually the three friends, but Elihu himself. And it's fascinating because here's someone that actually seems to want to vindicate Job, want to help him. At least that's what it seems. At least we know that Elihu starts in a way that he doesn't want to condemn Job because he's frustrated because the friends have condemned him. And here he's saying, I want to vindicate you. Anyway, as it goes, we then enter chapter 34 and we find the next section there in verse 5 to 6. Listen to this. It says, Job says, I'm innocent, but God denies me justice. Although I'm right, I'm considered a liar. Although I'm guiltless, his arrows inflict an incurable wound. And this is fascinating as he picks up on what Job has been saying through all of the things that he has been saying. He's saying, you say that I'm innocent and that God denies me justice. And then verse 6, although I'm right, I am considered a liar. Although I am guiltless, his arrows inflict an incurable wound. And so we felt that way when Job was speaking previously and how he was seeing things, is he would tell us that he was blameless, he was upright, he feared God, he shunned evil. We are told that by author, by God, by Job himself at times, and yet he is afflicted. He is afflicted by all sorts of things from God, and this is a big problem for Elihu. This doesn't fit his system. This doesn't sound right. Listen to what he says in verse 7. Is there anyone like Job who drinks scorn like water? This is fascinating what he's actually saying. He's saying, is there anyone like Job who misunderstands what is happening to them, where they're actually being scorned, where they are actually being challenged and afflicted for a purpose, drinks it like water, as if they are supposed to drink it, rather than realize that something needs to change. And then he carries on, he keeps company with evildoers, he associates with the wicked, for he says there is no profit in trying to please God. So listen to me, verse 10, you men of understanding, far be it from God to do evil, from the Almighty to do wrong. So the big issue with this section, or at least what Elihu is bringing to light here, is he's saying, Job, you are wrong to think that God will afflict you. God doesn't do things like that. God is not a God who afflicts and allows suffering to happen for the sake of suffering happening. Even if you say you are upright, then something is wrong. Either you're saying that you are upright but you're not, or you're saying that God does wicked or evil things. And so that is Elihu's way of thinking about it. Notice what else he says, and he tries to strengthen his argument in verses 17 to 20. And these are strong words, and there's a lot of richness and truth in it. But listen to what he says. Can someone who hates justice govern? Will you condemn the just and mighty one? He is not the one who says is he not the one who says to the kings, you are worthless, and to nobles, you are wicked? Who shows no partiality to princes and does not favor the rich over the poor, for they are all the work of his hands. They die in an instant in the middle of the night, and the people are shaken and they pass away. The mighty are removed without human hand. And so what he is actually just trying to paint you, and just to help you understand, is he's saying when you look at God's justice, God is perfectly just. He knows how to be just. You think that it is unjust to be afflicted by God, or maybe the friends think that it is just because you have sinned. But there's some error in these arguments, and he is saying God is perfectly just. Now this is true. God is perfectly just. But when we say that God is perfectly just, what is that definition of justice? The real challenge is, do we think God is just according to our definition of justice? Or do we think that God is just, which is a term that is only capable to be defined by God himself? And so this becomes the challenge. Elihu seems to think that, well, God is just, but according to the understanding of what justice is, rather than God is just according to who God is. So that's a funny and slight nuance that you need to be aware of. When you today think about God, when you say, well, God is a just God, are you and now think this through, are you actually saying, well, God is just according to what I understand justice to be? Or are you saying that God is just according to who God is? That's a massive difference. Because if you're saying that God is just according to what I understand justice to be, that can change from one person to the next person. But when you say that God is just according to who God is, what that defines is something that we can't fully grasp. God's justice goes beyond what we see, what we perceive, what we understand, what we think we know. God's justice exceeds our human understanding. And so then we move to chapter 35, just to see the next section, at least the next thing that he picks up from Job. He says, verse 2, "Do you think this is just? You say, I am in the right, and not God. Yet you ask him, what profit is it to me? And what do I gain by not sinning?" And this is fascinating because, well, there is so much in actually what he is saying here. If we just turn to verse 8, listen to these words, chapter 35, verse 8. "Your wickedness only affects humans like yourself, and your righteousness only other people." I mean, that's a fascinating statement that he says. He's saying, well, your wickedness and your righteousness is actually something that is linear. That is something that works in this realm between other human beings. It's got nothing to do with a vertical relationship with you and God. Your righteousness or your wickedness is actually, it affects those around you. And God will deal with it. But what that affects is actually really the people around you. So God's justice over your wickedness is actually to set things right so that you stop harming, or whatever the case may be, so that you will better serve those around you. What Elihu lacks is to see that there is a connection between your relationship with God, your righteousness or your wickedness, and how that affects that relationship. And then he says in verse 12, he does not answer when people cry out because of the arrogance of the wicked. And so he's saying, well, now he's zooming in and he's saying, well, listen, Job, the reason why God isn't answering you is because you're arrogant. This is why the friends have stopped talking, because they see you as seeing yourself as righteous, and that's why they've kept quiet now. And ultimately, that's your arrogance, and that's the reason why God's not going to answer you. He's not going to answer people when they cry out, when they are actually arrogant in their wickedness. And so this is fascinating as we just see how he keeps he's refining his thoughts on what justice looks like and how God's justice functions. And so he argues. And so this is the big issue. There's an issue of justice here for Elihu. There's an issue of the sin that is still lingering in Job's life. But will Job listen or will he not? If Job listens, then perhaps things will change for him. Perhaps things will get better. But as we turn to the next section, there comes this conclusion of thoughts as he drives his point home. So just keeping in mind, just looking at those three sections once more. The first section, he's really arguing with Job by saying, just to remember what he's picked up, says, "I am pure, I have done no wrong, I am clean and free from sin, yet God has found fault with me. He considers me his enemy. He fastens my feet in shackles. He keeps close watch on all my paths." And Elihu picks up on that and he says, no. This is being used so that you may avoid the grave, that you may avoid the pit, so that you may come back to God. And God will do this to you because you need to be set right. And this is how God acts in justice. And then he turns to the next point and he says, well, Job, you said I'm innocent, but God denies me justice. Although I am right, I am considered a liar. Although I am guiltless, his arrow afflicts an incurable wound. And so he then says, but what is happening to you is not God doing anything wicked. It is you who have done something. There's something in your life that needs to change. And he hasn't yet said it as the friends say it, but he's building to that. And he really is going to say that ultimately. And then the final statement, as he says, Job says, "Do you think this is just? You say, I I am in the right, not God. Yet you ask him, what profit is it to me, and what do I gain by not sinning? And so now he is saying, listen, Job, you've got the wrong mindset. You've got the wrong way of thinking about this. God's justice is bigger than what you think. But in light of that, your life, your conduct is something that affects people around you, not something that affects God. And that's what upsets God. That's the issue. But then listen to what he says in chapter 36 as he starts drawing to a conclusion. He says this: he does not take his eyes off the righteous. He enthrones them with kings and exalts them forever. So now we know that Job is upright, that he's blameless, that he fears God, and he shuns evil. And he's saying, well, if that is the case, then you should be seated, you should be enthroned, you should be exalted forever. But listen to this: but if people are bound in chains, held fast by cords of affliction, he tells them what they have done, that they have sinned arrogantly. He makes them listen to correction and commands them to repent of their evil. If they obey and serve him, they will spend the rest of their days in prosperity and their years in contentment. But if they do not listen, they will perish by the sword and die without knowledge. And so here Elihu comes with this final punch, really. This is the final punch in his argument that really drives it home. And he says, listen, Job, don't be arrogant. Don't be arrogant in your sin. You have sinned. You are arrogant. But if you repent, you will gain prosperity. But you will not until you see that what God is doing to you is to refine you, to draw you away from the pit and back to him into righteousness, to learn what righteousness is all about, to learn how to be upright. But you need to listen. You need to listen to what people have to say to you. You need to listen to what people have shared with you. Verse 17, but now you are laden with a judgment due the wicked. Judgment and justice have taken hold of you. This is your state, Job. This is the condition that you're in. It is because you are wicked. And now Elihu sounds like the friends. Elihu sounds like the friends that have condemned Job. The three friends have done it. Elihu got upset, and now he is saying that Job is laden due to the wicked judgment, due to the wicked he has done, and judgment and justice have taken hold of him. And then he says in verse 21, beware of turning to evil, which you seem to prefer to affliction. Be aware of that. Stop turning to that. But then Elihu makes a statement that crumbles his whole argument. It breaks down everything that he actually says, because there's so much truth in what he says. But when he says it in light of Job, who we know is blameless, upright, who fears God and shuns evil, it breaks his whole argument. He turns in verse 26 and he says, how great is God beyond our understanding? The number of his years is past finding out. God is beyond our understanding. So Elihu, how do you know? Elihu, how do you know that what is happening to Job isn't something that is actually beyond your understanding? Because we know that God has permitted it, but this seems to exceed your understanding. And then chapter 37, I'm not going to look at that too much. There's just two things that I might highlight there, but chapter 37 really, it just drives more nails into Elihu's own argument, as he says, well, consider God. Consider his greatness. Look at his creation. Look at everything that he has made. Look how he thunders from heaven. He's beyond our understanding. Listen to verse 5. It says, God's voice thunders in marvelous ways. He does great things beyond our understanding. And listen to verse 24. Therefore people revere him, for does he not have regard for all the wise in heart? That's a peculiar thing that he concludes with. But he says we need to fear God. Fear God. But doesn't he have regard for those that have wisdom in their heart, that fear him? Yes, that's true. But perhaps there is something that is misplaced here, Elihu. Yes, you are almost there, Elihu drives Job to God. He says, look at God. He's the first one of all the friends that have spoken to Job to actually point Job to God and say, consider who God is, how great he is, how marvelous he is, how beyond understanding he is. But God is beyond your understanding. Don't think you can understand how God acts and functions. Yes, some things may seem obvious, but God is incredibly complex. And what is happening to Job here is complex, because we are told that God permitted it, but it doesn't fit the system, the way of thinking that the three friends have had and Elihu has. Elihu still wants to go into the category of you've done something wrong and God is now trying to draw you out of it. What's slightly different with what Elihu says versus the friends. The friends saying, Job, you have done wicked and that's why you're facing this. They don't say anything else. Whereas Elihu says, well, you've probably done something wicked, but God is wanting to redeem you. He's wanting to get you out of that space, save you from the pit. So listen. Whereas we know that God has allowed this to happen to Job without reason. Fascinating how the book of Job is pieced together. And I know this is a long section today, and there's so much to really actually consider and think about. But as we conclude, keep in mind who Job is, that he does fear God, that he does shun evil, that he is upright and that he is blameless. This is who we are told he is. And that God's wisdom is exceptionally profound and beyond our understanding. There are some fantastic truths in what Elihu says. But again, we need to be careful that the words that we speak are not simply what we think and how we think it should apply to a person by what we perceive and what we understand or what we know, but that truly those words are informed and instructed by God's incredible wisdom. That God can't be boxed, that there isn't a simple answer to any problem, that sometimes it takes time to talk and discuss and hear and think and wrestle. And so I'm going to leave it at that, because next week is really going to shake and shatter our world when we hear the Lord speak. But as for this, I hope that it gets you to contemplate and consider just a little bit more the immense complexities of how complicated and beyond understanding God really is. That yes, we can grasp certain aspects of who he is and at times understand as truths. But to understand how God acts and why he does what he does is sometimes only answerable when we will be with him one day. So why does these things happen in this world that we live in? Perhaps that's not the question that we should be answering or asking. But instead, who is the Lord? Who is the Lord in the midst of our suffering? Who is the Lord in the midst of our hardship? Rather than why. Why is this happening? Ask who he is. Because the Lord will show us something fantastic as we turn to the next section next week. Well, I hope this encourages you. Hope it gets you to consider and think a little bit more deeply about the book of Job and a friend that you haven't seen yet, this Elihu character. But I pray that you may go and consider it all the more in the week to come. Have a lovely day, and we'll see you again next week. Cheers, bye.